an ITAG Agile Forum talk, so this is kind of long overdue. Want to give a huge welcome to Brian Tucker. So Brian is a principal consultant at Ivar Jacobson International. He's extensive experience in all things Agile, but particularly teaching, coaching, consulting on the Scaled Agile framework. He regularly delivers program consultant training, coaching, consulting experience in large, medium, small companies. Today he's going to give a talk on how agility can be scaled up to large groups of people, which hopefully is going to be interesting for everyone. We're going to record the session, and if there's any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and if we don't get to them during the talk, we'll cover them at the end. And just a quick reminder before I hand over to Ryan, we have some places left on the use case modeling for Agile at Scale course next week, which is also being delivered by Brian's company, Ivar Jacobson. So if you're interested in that, check it out on the ITAG website. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Brian. Thanks a million.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, hello, my name's Brian Tucker. I'm a principal consultant at Ivar Jacobson Ivar Jacobson International. I was the first scaled Agile program consultant trainer in Europe, and I'm a SAFE fellow. So I was invited by ITAG to come along and give this talk, and I've got no great agenda, not selling anything or anything like that. So the topics were chosen by ITAG. An overview of the latest developments in scaling agility, some practical advice on starting Agile release trains, and some insight into keeping it running. Probably somewhere between 30-40 minutes worth of discussions, which should give us a chance for some questions and answers at the end, hopefully. So developments in scaling agility. Now, over the last 10 years, encouraged by the Scaled Agile framework's success, a lot more methodologists have developed frameworks or methods for scaling agility. And if you were to go out and read the reports on the web, you might be forgiven for thinking that the different advice each methodologist provides puts them on completely different planets. This is because everyone highlights the differences between the advice, mostly to try and promote their advice over others. Whereas if you look at what they have in common, they have more in common than they do different. You could pretty much sum everything up by saying Scrum on Scrum recursively with some strategy and decisions at the top. So better questions to ask are not what are the differences, but what has each methodologist optimized their advice for? What support is provided to adopt their advice? Now, at Ivar Jacobson, through our work with Essence, which is a mechanism for describing processes, basically, so you can plug and play them. Well, through that, we've been lucky enough to work with most of the methodologists out there, and that gives us insight into the methods and their advice. But I do have to fully raise my hands and say that I've not been around attending all of the trainings, collecting all of the badges. So there is always a possibility that I've missed out on the little bit of magic that makes their advice so much better than the rest. But if that's true, I do have to argue, why didn't they write it down in the first place? Now, I'm always happy to be learned, to be proved wrong. If so, and if you know more about it than me, please do so. Please, catch me out in the questions. Quite happy for that to happen. Now, I also won't claim this is comprehensive either. I'm certain that there are frameworks, advice out there that I've missed and should be considered. Again, fill me in with the gaps at the questions towards the end. So Scrum at Scale. Developed by Jeff Sutherland, who is one of the fathers of the original team-level Scrum process that is fairly prevalent across the industry. Well, Jeff had been studying the Standish Group's annual chaos reports. And he thought he'd found an interesting correlation in the data between success, which is what we're all after, and the speed of response in those successful organizations. Those organizations that could respond to development impediments quickly were more likely to be successful. Quick feedback loops. So it's his assertion that this is why agility works. It puts the structures in place to encourage those feedback loops, to steer the teams towards success and minimize delays. And so his scaling methodology, it's optimized for speed of feedback. So Scrum at scale, the framework suggests use Scrum on Scrum recursively with an enterprise action team at the top to deal with strategy and corporate level impediments. Line up the Scrum cycles, particularly the daily stand-ups, so that you can get an impediment from the team up to the enterprise action team in under 24 hours. Probably a lot quicker if you schedule them so they're one after the other. And therefore you can get a response back down in an equally fast time. And that's pretty much it. You have to evolve everything else yourself. Delivery pipelines, work format, etc. Which is great if you've got the experience within your organization to do that. Challenging if you haven't. Nexus. This is developed by Ken Schwaber, who is the other half of Scrum, basically. It utilizes Scrum again, and it's optimized to try and achieve collaboration with as flat a hierarchy as possible. Generally, product owners collaborating together without anyone above telling them what to do. A very purist self-organization approach. Beyond that, as with Scrum at scale, you have to evolve everything else to support that: tooling, development processes, high-level strategy. Scrum was and is successful because it was so lightweight. It provided a structure for managing agile teams without dictating to the teams how they actually do the work. For a management process to have survived 20 years, I think now, in the IT industry, must be getting close to a record. Some of that keep it simple approach has rubbed off on Jeff and Ken's scaling advice, hence they describe the bare minimum to scale, and you sort of have to work out the rest. Unfix. This is Jürgen Appello of Management 3.0 fame. He classes this as a toolkit rather than a framework, a set of advice on how to set up teams and structures that draws inspiration from Spotify, but also extends the advice from the hugely popular Team Topologies book by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pei. It's optimized for flexibility of team structures, so the teams can self-organize to solve the challenges they are facing. That was a Freudian slip there, isn't it? Facing. The teams have to work out what processes they're going to use. If they lack that experience, then this can be challenging. And so that leads us on now to the Scaled Agile Framework, developed by Dean Leffingwell and an increasingly large company of people. I mean, I remember it when it was 3 men in Dean's garage. It is now 2 floors of an office block in Boulder, Colorado, and well over 100, probably pushing 200 staff now. It's optimized for getting large groups of people aligned and collaborating together. And there is over 10 years, probably more, of accumulated knowledge embedded in the framework. And it provides suggestions and advice for almost everything, from team level engineering at the bottom to portfolio management at the top. And there is a comprehensive set of training material to help educate people. Now, Dean is a serial entrepreneur. He knew from the very beginning that it's the big organizations that have the money. He saw the challenges they were facing, And it wasn't just agility, it was how do we transition to agility? Hence the volume of supporting material that Scaled Agile provides to help with that transition. So which one is best? Well, this quickly descends into a religious war, often involving people basing their assessment of the framework on bad implementations or their own personal prejudices. Once you are operating in an agile fashion, with the feedback loops of sprints set up and running, then given that everything is Scrum on Scrum on Scrum, you can pretty much pick and choose from the advice from all of them. Scrum at scale style rapid feedback within a safe implementation. Sure, that's going to work. Just line up your daily stand-ups so that they can feed into one another. Nothing there to stop that happening. A Nexus flat hierarchy? Well, as long as the teams have got work to do, it's up to the product owners how they want to organize themselves. If they want to put an ultimate leader above them rather than collaborating together, they can do so. If they want to collaborate together, that would work as well. And that's also sort of what Unfix is talking about. So really, we're all talking about the same thing and just different interpretations and optimizations of it. What has made SAFe most popular is that it gives non-agile organizations help in starting their agile journeys. Does that make it the best? No, but I don't think any of them are best. It's not one is better than the other. But what it does provide is help for that first step, starting to be agile. That isn't as prominent in some of the other frameworks. Ultimately, they are all just tools, and tools can be abused as much as they can be used correctly. If you want to interpret their advice in such a way that you recreate the old world, but with some shiny new agile terminology, then you can do that. They have no physical means of stopping you. Agility is hard because it's a set of behaviors, not processes. The frameworks are trying to provide processes to support and encourage the right behaviors, but ultimately, whether people behave right is a people problem. But if you have people behaving right, then the choice of framework doesn't really matter, because they'll be evolving and improving in order to suit their current needs and can draw advice from all of the frameworks. Now, I've not mentioned David Anderson's Kanban processes. I've not mentioned we don't need frameworks. We just need team topologies, Wardley's mapping, and domain-driven design. And my boss, Eva, is probably going to complain at me that I didn't use this opportunity to promote Essence. But I've covered as much as I can in this sort of 10-minute slot. So I hope that was a little bit of a useful overview of some of the things that are out there, and a little bit of a hint at the end there that there's other things you can also go off and draw upon as well, and that they have more in common. Once you're up and running in an agile fashion, you can learn and utilize all of them. So starting agile release trains, a little bit of advice and insight into this. And over my 12-something years with the Scaled Agile framework, I've got a lot of agile release trains started in a lot of different industries. So the first thing is train everyone and start your release trains. That little piece of advice came from one of the earliest rollouts of the Scaled Agile framework over a decade ago. Train everyone came from the first rollout at Nokia, and I was part of that first rollout. And when it says everyone, it means everyone, bottom to top. The mistake we made at Nokia in that first rollout was that we thought it was an engineering problem. So the engineers all got trained, but the senior management didn't. And when the senior managers tried to control things using the old techniques they knew from before, it all went wrong, because the agile systems we'd instigated underneath are now operating in a completely different manner. So everyone needs training, not the same training. You've got to tailor it to their roles and what the challenges, the problems they face, but they do need training because this world behaves differently from what's gone before. And then start trains. I think this is partly attributable to Philips, who were another one of the early adopters. They kept saying, next month, we'll start the train next month. You won't see the benefits of collaboration if you don't start the Agile release trains. But starting an Agile release train looks hard. So how do you start an Agile release train? Well, Scaled Agile provide a checklist for what needs to be done, but it doesn't provide a lot of advice about how to approach that challenge. Now, obviously, everyone's approach is going to be slightly different because everyone is slightly different, but there should be some patterns, some commonality that can be distilled into advice. And when I'm getting an Agile release train started, there are 5 things that need to be in place for the first PI planning event. The PI planning event being represented by this green milestone post on the right-hand side. And the 5 threads that I am looking at are a prioritized backlog. After all, it is the primary input to the planning event. You're going to need facilities and facilitation in order to help conduct the planning event. An architectural runway describing our technical strategy for whatever it is we are building through the planning event. Aligned stakeholders. And finally, trained teams, enough training that they know how to survive the planning event and start operating in an agile fashion beyond that point. So prioritized backlog is the first one. And it's the product management and product owner organization group that is responsible for that backlog. So we need to work out who is going to form that group of people, who is going to play those roles. And you need that knowledge early in your adoption. Do they know what they're doing? Probably not if they've come from the old world. So they're going to need some sort of training. And SAFE provides Leading SAFE as the introductory course and specialized courses for product managers and product owners to describe how to build the backlog. They need to do a stakeholder mapping activity. Who are the stakeholders that this release train should be engaging with? And working with those stakeholders, they can develop a vision and a roadmap. Where are we trying to get to as a release train? Not in the next few weeks, but in the next few months, the sort of next few years type territory. And from that vision and roadmap, we can then ask, well, what's the work we need to do now in the next 10 or 12 weeks and focus on that? And that is building the backlog. Now, I know it's represented here as one ticket. That's going to be many repetitive activities to take individual features, work with the stakeholders, subject matter experts, architects to understand the business needs in that feature and prepare it ready for PI planning. Once you've built your set of features, you've got your backlog ready, the next task is prioritizing it. And SAFE provides a process known as the weighted shortest job first, WSJF for short, to help with that. It brings some economic logic to the prioritization process, not just whoever shouts loudest, but we actually consider value. And value isn't always external value. It can be internal value as well. It's valuable to us as an organization because it helps improve the organization, or it gives us knowledge and insight in what to build in the future. And it's also skewed towards smaller items, the shortest job part of the weighted shortest job first. This is because smaller items flow through delivery processes better, more efficiently than big things. So it's leaning towards the principles of flow as well. That done, that gets us a prioritized backlog, and then the product manager needs to prepare a presentation to be able to communicate that to the assembled staff at the planning event. What are the features? What's their priority? And who to talk to if you want more information. You don't need to get all of the information across in the presentations because most of the people present don't need that information. But they do need to know who to talk to, who's got the extra insight if they happen to pick up that feature and go and plan it. So that's got us a prioritized backlog, facilities and facilitation next. So this falls to the release train engineer and Scrum Master community. Do they know what they're doing? Not if they've tried coming from the old world, they don't. So they need training, and there is training courses available for all of that. Book the big room. Set that date when you are having the PI planning event, and that creates a time box. And that's quite powerful because it stops the work forever extending into the future. It forces you to start the train. And if you don't get everything quite perfect, it doesn't matter because you're working now in a cyclic system. 10, 12 weeks time, you've got another opportunity to fix things, make them better, improve things as we're going along. So remember, we're always running these feedback cycles. We then have the 3 Ps, pizza, pens, and projectors, basically is how I phrase it. If you've got 100 people in a big room together for 2 days, you're going to need to feed them and water them. That's where the pizzas come in. Pens, the stationery, the equipment that they're going to need in order to do the planning activities. In the old world, it was Post-it notes, buckets of them coming out of bags and ears in order to help plan these things. And then projectors, the IT equipment for broadcasting, communicating to the big room as a whole. Now, of course, in the current world, most of this is still being done online, virtually, rather than physically. So we're not going to be posting pizzas out to every single engineer at their home address. It's going to be done through our IT systems, but you're going to need all of that set up regardless. Flights, hotels, visas, if you were traveling around the world. Not that the RTE Scrum Masters are going to do this for everyone. They just need to make sure that people have actually booked themselves into the right place at the right time and are going to be there. Finally, the release train engineer, they need to collate all of the other presentations together into one place. And you've probably all been there, stood in front of the projector with your laptop plugged in and nothing is quite working correct. The projector or the laptop, they're not talking, they're not sharing with each other, and it's all a little bit embarrassing. It's even more embarrassing when there's 100 engineering staff watching you and waiting expectantly. So let's not put ourselves in that position. When you've got this much going on, one projector, one laptop, one set of presentations, and do not disconnect any of them. So that's got us to facilities and facilitation, architectural runway next. So this is the realm of the system architects. And system architects in SAFe, it's the architecture of the software system, yes, but also falling into this camp, you've got things like security, compliance, regulation, specialized UI, UX type expertise as well. They all come in the same sphere of influence. So we need to know who's playing those roles. Do they know what they're doing? Not necessarily, so there's training to be done there. And then they have to develop the architectural strategy. And if you do have those specialized roles, security, compliance type things, then you're delegating some of that strategy to those experts and their area of expertise. Definitions of done. You're going to need a definition of done at both the story level and the feature level if you're running safe. And the definition of done is quality. And quality is a technical concern. What are all the technical practices we should have gone through to try and ensure that we are building good quality software and solutions? So that's why it lies with the technical strand, and architecture represents the technical strand. Then we're on to building the backlog. Now, the architects, they will be putting features into the backlog, so they have to create their own features. In SAFe, those tend to be known as enablers, but they will also have input into the main business features that the product management, product ownership group are suggesting. Do the business features have significant architectural impact? Let's capture that and any advice and insight in the features there. Are there security, regulatory, compliance concerns? Again, capture the insight into the features, and it will then drive conversations in planning. In order to prioritize the features, we're going to need to estimate them so that the smaller ones, the shortest ones, can get a bit of a foothold and get prioritized above the bigger ones. An estimation is a technical concern again. So this falls to the system architect to organize. They do it by drawing upon a set of the engineering staff, aim for the 5 to 9 sort of range, and cover all the technical disciplines, all the bases, and then that group can produce estimates for the features to feed into the prioritization. The architect needs to be at the prioritization, both to champion their own features, the enablers, but also if the estimates need to change in the event because the people involved in prioritizing slice the features up to make them smaller to get things prioritized, then we're going to have to adjust the estimates on the fly. But having participated in generating the estimates, the architect should be able to make some sensible adjustments if necessary. And then finally, that architectural strategy, it needs to be communicated. So they need to prepare a presentation and hand it over to the RTE for collation. Align stakeholders. Now, we identify the stakeholders here because it's actually part of the stakeholder mapping activities up here. Once we've got the stakeholders, they're going to need training so they understand how the new world works, and then they help they help elaborate the vision and roadmap. So this vision and roadmap ticket is the same as the one at the top here, one and the same thing. Same is true of building the backlog. We're going to need the stakeholders' inputs into creating the features. We're doing it for them after all. So what do they need out of a feature, as well as product management, product ownership, putting in their insight, and subject matter experts and architects putting in their insight as well. It can all feed in. Finally, it's the stakeholders that actually provide insight into what's valuable and what's not valuable that goes into the weighted shortest job first process. The weighted shortest job first is actually a mechanic for generating stakeholder alignment as much as it is for prioritizing the work. So we actively involve them in doing the prioritization. Finally, the most senior of them, they have to prepare the context briefing. What is the bigger, wider context? How do we fit within the company as a whole? And what is the company trying to achieve? Often that's not new work. They're just repurposing context briefings that have gone before in the organization. But we need to point, how do we fit this release train within the bigger thing? And then you need to train the teams. Now, you need to know who's going to be on the teams early so that you know how much of a backlog to produce. But you actually want to defer training of the teams until the very last minute, sometimes literally only a day or two beforehand. Because up until that point, all the way through here, the teams are keeping the lights on. They're keeping the world turning. You think you've got a better way of doing it, which is why you're transforming. But up until the point where you transform, that first PI planning event, the old way is still the best way because it's the only way you've got at the moment. So let's not disturb the actual engineering staff until the last minute. And training them at the last minute also means they don't forget the training they've received. Whereas if you train them earlier, then the old world starts reasserting itself. So defer that until the last minute. The facilitation staff within a release train, the product managers, architects, release train engineers, they've got lots of prep to do, but we leave the engineering staff alone as much as possible. So that's a bit of insight into how to sort of lay up the activities that need to happen in order to get from let's go agile to your actual first PI planning event. It's not an exhaustive list. I mean, if you've got to sort out compliance and regulatory processes, they're going to end up being somewhere in there. And there's probably other things that you might need to do. And if I'm doing this for real, it's not just a clean linear timeline like this. We actually stick the weeks up so we know when these things are happening and can start getting events and activities into people's diaries, basically. But that's a fairly standard sequence to get things up and running. So a couple of other things to talk about. Well, do set that date, start your release train, start generating insight. If you are coaching an agile release train, help it transform itself, but don't do the work for them. You shouldn't be building their backlog if you're a coach, because you're not the experts, they are. So you support them, you help them do their work, but they actually have to do it. You know, the people that are going to play the roles of release train engineers are going to play the role of product managers. They've got to do it. As an external consultant, you know, I'm in the position where I often don't know the work being done. So I have to get them to do it. And if you're booking things like rooms or Zoom calls and stuff for all these things, it has to be the facilitation staff because I don't have access to any of their systems. It becomes a little harder to maintain that separation when you're internal. Don't expect immediate perfection. You're not going to get it right straight out on your first PI planning event. You probably won't get it badly wrong because too many people want it to be successful for it to go badly wrong, but it won't be perfect. Indeed, there's an argument to say it will never be perfect. All we can ever do is keep retrospecting and evolving. And we are now in a cyclic system. Every 10 or 12 weeks, you do have this ability to try something different, to get better and keep working at that. And you need to evolve anyway, because the challenges you are facing now are not the challenges you're going to face in the future. So we've got to always keep evolving to meet future challenges. Do try and free the train from old world reporting and the old world processes. If the train is forever required to keep reporting progress in an old world format that its agile metrics just don't support, it gets very frustrating. If you're having to conform to processes that don't align with agility, like let's get all the designs signed off up front, that's going to cause friction as well. Try to ensure the features are business challenges. They are business needs, problems for the teams and trains to solve. If you start sending down solutions, if you start telling the teams what to do, it breaks the empowerment of self-organization. So always problems, challenges for the teams to solve, and then support the teams in developing the solutions. It promotes the self-organization. If you don't do that, if you don't encourage self-organization, then you really haven't transitioned from the old world of just instructing people. And finally, don't try and preempt PI planning. Lots of people look at PI planning and say, 2 days, everyone together, that's really expensive. Let's try and compress it down. Let's spend 4 days preparing for it. But you've just turned a 2-day event into a 5-day event, 4 of which are done offline where we can't collaborate with the other teams. And PI planning is all about mapping out collaborations. So careful you don't try and over-optimize and break your own process. It's there to encourage discussions, negotiation, and collaboration. Please do that. So that's a little bit about getting release trains up and running. How do we then keep them running? Well, first of these, or the first thing to talk about is I'm not going to talk about the practicalities of keeping release trains running. There's plenty of advice out there about how to do things. This is going to look at, in sort of 10 minutes or so, the why are we doing some of these things. So the first thing is separate your targets, your forecasts, and your commitments. And this comes from, I can never get the name right, so we can all have a good laugh at my pronunciation. I think it's Bjart Bosnes, which is a Norwegian name. He's beyond budgeting. He's the beyond budgeting guy, basically. And it's separate these 3 things out. You want to set the targets where you are trying to get to. And in a release train context, that is, what are we trying to achieve in this program increment? And they do want to be aspirational, you know, a little bit of a stretch, but they do need to be realistic. How do we know whether they're realistic? Well, we can forecast, we can predict. That needs an idea of what we think we are trying to do in terms of the work, and we combine that with real-time information about how much can the teams do. And that tells us whether we have a chance of hitting those targets. But we need that real-time information. And that real-time information comes from making commitments and seeing whether we've managed to meet those commitments, which is the running of our time boxes in the Agile world. The sprints, the 2-week sprints at the team level, if you're in SAFe, then the 10 or 12-week program increments at the higher level. Running those time boxes and asking yourself, did we meet what we planned to do, which is the commitment in those time boxes? That generates you insight that you can feed into the forecasting that tells you whether you can hit your targets. But if you're not making that commitment, if you're not saying as a team what you think you can achieve and understanding whether you've done it, then the business has a tendency to fall back on targets as their commitments, and bad things lie that way because those targets haven't been rationalized through the rest of the process. So keeping these things separate is key. So what are the metrics we start getting up out of Agile release trains? Well, there's lots you can gather and possibly should be gathering, but I distill these down into 4 groups. The first is the velocity of the train or the team. How much can they get done? And we need that information for forecasting. Are we going to get through the work? How quickly can we get through the work? But you also need to know how predictable your train is. Is it repeatedly meeting these commitments or close enough? You're never going to expect perfection, but are we reliably meeting most of our commitments? And if you are reliably meeting most of your commitments, then that gives you confidence, trust in your forecasts. If you're not reliably meeting your commitments, then you can't trust your forecast, can you? And it also causes other problems with systemic improvement that we wish to do. Quality. Does our system work as expected? And this sort of information is going to bubble up out of the continuous delivery pipeline. the build and test tools that you have instigated. And that gives you confidence that it's behaving as you want, that it is compliant. Now, that can be official compliance, as in it meets certain needs, certain demands, some of which might have been imposed upon you by external regulators, or it could just be localized compliance. It does what we expect it to do. Finally, value. Is what we've done generated value for the company? Have we done the right thing? And this is a difficult one for the release trains to measure, because how does a release train know that the little bit of functionality it's done has generated the profits for the company as a whole? Often there is no tight linkage between these two things to sort of hold them together. We often just summarize, have we done the right thing in terms of value, because the product we sell, the system we produce, you know, it seems to be doing all right at the top as far as the business is concerned. But always be looking to that. Sometimes it might just be as simple as, well, the functionality we've produced, the feature, are people using it? That's enough to draw a little bit of insight. So those are the 4 facets that I would be looking at. And obviously there's more you can drill down and detail you can get into in all of those. So coordination. If we got lots of teams working together, then we need to coordinate between the teams. And ultimately, this is going to end up with people on one team talking to people on another team. And we would prefer, if the knowledge and insight that team A should be talking to team B, we prefer it if it came from the teams themselves through self-organization, rather than management trying to impose it from above. Ideally, we should be planning ahead that team A and team B need to interact. In SAFe, this starts at PI planning and is one of the key purposes of PI planning, is identifying these collaborations. But also at the sprint planning, we can, refine that further. If we're interacting with another team, when's it happening? Which day? Have we started organizing meeting rooms and Outlook invites? And then right down to daily stand-ups, which are a planning event that focuses on the next 24 hours. Who's working with who? Who's actually going to go to the meeting? Hand over the artifact to the other team, whatever that collaboration might need to be. Now, this may sound like a lot of planning, but it does help generate alignment. And I did some quick calculations. 2 days out of 10 a week PI is just 4% of your PI. Half a day out of a 2-week, 10-day sprint is 5% of the sprint, and a 15-minute stand-up out of an 8-hour day is just 3% of the day. Becoming unaligned, doing the wrong thing, delaying value, that's going to rapidly outstrip any amount of time spent planning, particularly when it's such short amounts of time that we're actually doing the planning. Don't confuse planning with doing, and don't end up doing the doing in planning. You plan to do the work in the rest of the day or the rest of the sprint or the rest of the program increment. Don't try and solve all the problems of the work in the planning events themselves. And this only works out if preparation is done right. Work needs to be problems the team collaborates on to solve. If the work ends up being tasks, instructions, then the ability to self-organize gets lost. People just end up doing their own thing, and all of the agile processes start to break down. Why do you need to explain to everyone else what you're doing when you're the only one doing it, and they've got their own things to do? That's a particular smell, a particular problem you often see happening in daily stand-ups when the teams aren't actually collaborating. So agility itself is predicated on teams collaborating to solve the problems together as a team. The plan, do, check, adjust loops are running throughout. If you're at scale, then those loops are nested within one another. The time boxes form loops. Sprints form a feedback loop that fits within the program increment, but also the work items form loops. Stories sit within features that sit within a plan, do, check, adjust loop running at the level of safe epics. Agility is when you use the outputs of running one loop to inform future loops or a bigger loop. If you're not adjusting, then you're just blindly plowing through the work in an old world fashion. The challenge is that as you make adjustments, people won't like what they're hearing. But the truth is going to come out eventually. Better you get it out now so you can make adjustments now rather than the truth emerging at the end when there's no time to do anything about it. Which is why it's so important to have the targets, the forecasts, and the commitments separate. So the truth coming out of the commitments can feed into the forecasts to give you insight into whether you can hit that target, and we can affect the current plans to try and make sure we do hit that target. And so that sort of brings my time to a close. A little bit longer than I was expecting, but hopefully that's been useful and interesting and you've gained some insight there. And we've got 10 minutes or so free for questions. So anyone, any thoughts? Anyone, any questions?
Super talk, Ryan. Thank you. Andrew, I see you posted a question in the room. Do you want to ask that, or will I read it out? Or so the question was, so the product manager is the project manager, different terms. Do you want to clarify the difference?
Product manager, yeah. So product manager is sort of a scaling of the product ownership role from Scrum, which is all about what should we be producing, and how do we make the product the team looks after successful. And that could be single team if you're Scrum and it's a product owner. It could be Agile release train, lots of teams owning a bigger product and having a product manager to help facilitate and coordinate the group of product owners. So their focus is our product successful? And that differs from a project manager, which is all focused around, are they doing the work? Now that's really quite a profound change, but a very important change, because it's not just about the work, it's about, is the work we've done valuable? Now, some good project managers were actually thinking about that anyway, and good projects should be thinking about that. But there's not always goodness out there. There's a lot of bad out there. But if you are good, you are thinking about value, then transitioning to, is my product successful, should be an easy transformation for people. Because in SAFe, there are no projects. It's not about the transient pieces. It's all about setting up stable long-term structures to look after products that are themselves long-term. And then we just work through them. And so it becomes about the product itself. Is that successful? It comes about making sure we've got a good flow of changes to that product, which is where the facilitation and self-improvement comes in. Now that transition itself is a huge one to talk about, because it then goes on and starts dealing with, well, if you're not funding projects, but you're funding people, we've got to redirect the flow of money. And that's